Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. In this episode, we have part 2 of my conversation with the Anadromist Byrne Power, and we're talking about eras in rock music. Now, in this episode, we focus on the music primarily from the 1970s, and we cover all kinds of genres including hard rock, heavy metal, glam rock, progressive rock, pub rock, punk rock, soul, funk, jazz fusion, among others. It's a great conversation. Now, before we get started, I would like to give a big thanks to one of my viewers named Cankersaurus. Now, without being asked, he has donated twice to this channel through YouTube gifts. I want to thank you for doing this. I do this as a labor of love. I have never asked for any money, but I do appreciate it. And, if anyone else would like to donate, that would be great. At some point, I may set up a Patreon or some other sort of donation platform, so maybe I can expand the channel a little more. Again, thank you very much.
Welcome back to the second part, might be 3, we'll see, of 20th Century. James Wallace is with me from 20th Century Music and Arts. I'm Byrne here on the Anadrome, coming to you on a nice overcast day on Tbilisi, Georgia. What I like about the overcast days right now is that, unlike Canada, where I'm sure it's still kind of cold, here, when we shift from, we just go like from spring straight into summer. And I'm looking down the line going, when's it going to hit 25 or whatever like that? 75.
Yeah, we've had some pretty weird weather. That's all I'll say. It's gone up, down, up, down. It's crazy.
Right. So last time we kind of ended this, and we're just talking about it. We're not trying to do any sort of major study. We're just having a conversation about different periods. And last time we ended up talking about the end of the hippie era and how that shaded off into the California sound, which was still connected to the hippie era because all those people had been hippies. And it kind of goes into the Eagles, and you start to get the darker stuff like Hotel California. That whole album is pretty dark. And their next album, The Long Run, is even darker with songs like The Disco Strangler and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So, and because they couldn't keep up the dream of California anymore, you can check in anytime you want, but you can never leave.
Yeah, and you had that whole sarcasm from that era. You can hear it in Steely Dan. You can hear it in even like people like Jackson Brown.
It's kind of hinting at postmodernism.
Yeah,
it hasn't quite gotten to the clipping quotes from everything yet, but even still, some of the stranger characters in the California sound were like Tom Waits and Randy Newman.
Yeah.
Randy Newman was completely sarcastic. You never knew what he believed what he was saying. I mean, you kind of did, but it was a very different kind of music. But nevertheless, it was all coming out of this Californian melange. There were a couple of things I wanted to pick up on very briefly from the hippie era, because we talked so much about the hippies, and we talked about the British scene a bit, if I remember correctly. We did get up to kind of like the birth of heavy metal, and we'll talk
a little bit, yeah.
But we'll talk more about that. And then one of the couple of things I noticed that we didn't talk about. One very important thing was the 60s was also the period of soul and the birth of funk.
That's
so soul basically being an extra version of rhythm and blues from the 50s, but with much more gospel.
Yep.
And then that was Ray Charles was really instrumental in kicking that up a notch. And then you got to people like Sam Cooke, who was a gospel singer. Aretha Franklin was a gospel singer. Almost all of them are completely influenced by gospel, more than blues. And I would say that's kind of like the dividing line. The more gospel influence came in. And you had great singers like Otis Redding and Wilson Pickett, Aretha Franklin, of course, Tina Turner. And one of the most important ones was James Brown. Now, I remember as a kid having the experience of listening to the AM stations, which had, in my neighborhood, it was all regional then. So we got all of the early San Francisco stuff in a way that you wouldn't have gotten, because I was in the San Francisco Bay Area. You wouldn't have gotten this in Canada, for instance, the same way. Although you would have gotten the Canadian versions, which would have been people like the Poppers, who were a great Canadian band from that time. But I remember changing the channel and hearing this thing pop out at me. James Brown ruled the stations coming out of Oakland and Richmond, California, and you could pick those up. And sometimes it was just like, whoa, what is going on over there? But I found it really interesting, and sometimes I'd stay for a while on those. I think I know friends who grew up in the New York City area who were much more involved with soul music, and it was through James Brown, the Meters, and interestingly enough, Jimi Hendrix, who has a very kind of heavy emphasis in there, which will, I mean, something like Machine Gun. It can be seen totally as a rock song, but if you listen to the way it's moving, it's working like a funk song a bit too.
Yeah, well, the funk sound, a lot of people say the James Brown song Cold Sweat with the syncopated rhythm is the birth of funk, and you have those really tight dynamics. And yeah, you've mentioned a lot of great names there, like the Meters as well. James Brown's period he has in about 1970 is absolutely incredible. That's when he has a very young Bootsy Collins on bass, and I believe Bernie Worrell is in there as well. And when you mention the influence of Jimi Hendrix, the band that will kind of fuse that sound of James Brown and Jimi Hendrix and some of the other soul stuff is the Parliament Funkadelic Band.
Oh, I was thinking of someone a little earlier.
Yeah, but yeah, we can talk.
Can you think of who they are?
Well, you're probably thinking of Sly and the Family Stone.
Yeah, because they played at Woodstock. And they really said, interestingly enough, George Clinton was at Woodstock, although his impression of it from an interview I saw with him was that Woodstock was the end. And he said, after this, you're just going to get a bunch of jive. But before Parliament Funkadelic took off, Sly was doing this very strange thing where he was, I mean, if you listen to the first big hit he had, which was Dance to the Music, there's some very interesting stuff going on there. I mean, it's got a rock feel, but it's also got that whole thing where he's doing this. And some people say that's Africa, and I'm going like, no, it's a lot more mixed up than Africa. It's
that's some doo-wop. Yeah, doo-wop. That's what I was thinking.
But it's a sound that kind of goes back to minstrel music as well. And Sly knows his history. Very intelligent man. And he knew what he was doing when he brewed this thing together. And by the time you get to his early 70s album, There's a Riot Going On, that is one really depressing record. And that's completely a funk record by then.
Yeah. And the early Funkadelic albums are actually really, really interesting. I mean, one of the most incredible solo guitar pieces ever is off this 1971 album Maggot Brain, and that's the title track Maggot Brain, and it's just Eddie Hazel playing. It's one of the most emotional guitar pieces ever, but it's not self-indulgent, it's very enthralling. It's so they have this real rock edge in their sound, but they had I believe there were some issues with labeling and copyright, so they had two bands going. They had Parliament and they have Funkadelic, and Parliament actually puts out an album, I believe it's in 1970, where they're playing all kind of like country influenced music. It's really cool. And so he'd have Parliament albums and then Funkadelic would be more rock, and then by the mid 70s it just became Parliament Funkadelic, and that was wild stuff.
I remember hearing the first actual hit of Parliament. I believe it was I don't think it was I Want to Testify, but they were much more of a regular soul outfit. And then I guess George Clinton had an epiphany and started taking drugs and said, okay, I know which way we're going.
Yeah, they were called the Parliaments, I think, at that time.
Yeah, the Parliament. Yeah, or something like that, the Parliament.
Yeah.
But what's fascinating now, speaking of which, now, of course, you can't mention what's going on in the soul scene and the funk scene without mentioning the civil rights movement. I'm not going to go too deeply into this, except to say there was a sense, particularly after the death of Martin Luther King Jr., there was a sense of failure.
Yeah.
Many of the radicals, the Black Panthers and the SDS and other people were taking it way too far into revolutionary territory. But the music, meanwhile, James, this is like the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s is where James Brown starts going on his kind of Black Power phase. And he kind of remains up about it. But then if you, for instance, there's a great essay by Grail Marcus, and it's in his book Mystery Train, where he talks about Sly and the Family Stone and all of his influences, and then talks about he was on top of the world. I mean, literally, he was the most popular black act at that time. And not that black act is probably stretching it. That is to say, it makes him sound too connected to the soul sphere, which he wasn't. But when he put out "There's a Riot Going On," do you know how long the opening, the title track was on that album?
No, I can't recall that.
Yeah, nobody can. It's 0.00.
Okay.
And he did that on purpose. And he listens to that. There's one track, "Thank You for Talking to Me, Africa." The whole thing just sounds like what he had been doing, like "Thank You for Talking to Me, Africa," is a bit like a darker funk version of "Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again."
Yeah.
That album has no optimism whatsoever. And around the same time, you started seeing other stuff. For instance, that's around the time the Temptations put out the like absolute masterpiece of "Papa Was a Rolling Stone."
Yeah.
Which is what, 9 minutes, 10 minutes long. And it's just this downbeat groove. It's funk. And, but the message is kind of like "On All You Left Us Was Alone." It's like they're talking about the failure of the civil rights movement, the failure to really bring the whole thing up to where they wanted it to be. Then if the OJs, "Smiling Faces," sometimes they don't tell the truth. Fascinating stuff. Also around that early 70s period, you have War doing stuff like "The World Is a Ghetto." It's a fascinating period because it's so dark.
And there's another interesting factor that happens that I'm going to help. This is one of the next videos I'm going to do is when you have these huge festivals in the 60s, it would be blues and jazz musicians playing on them along with rock acts, these big festivals. Right. And one person who's watching people like Sly and the Family Stone, like James Brown, is Miles Davis. He's older, and he goes, I don't want to be irrelevant.
Right.
So he does something that's so unique and was very dismissed by sort of the big jazz critics at the time. And now people are looking back at it and saying it's extremely brilliant. When he starts, I mean, he already started getting people like Herbie Hancock playing an electric keyboard, but he starts bringing in electric instruments into the sound. And he creates this incredible, unique stew of music. So what he said, I mean, he makes a series of incredible albums that end where he just gets totally physically burned out. He had like cocaine addiction and all kinds of problems. But in the mid 70s, I mean, look at this level of influence he's taking in. He was being inspired by James Brown, Sly and the Family Stone, Ornette Coleman, and Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. Right. And that was the brew of his influences. And if you listen to those, I love the late 60s, early 70s Miles Davis electric period. And it's such a unique approach because it's like we're going to take rock, funk, even like African music, and we're going to meld it. But it's going to be the improv of jazz, but it's got a groove to it, but it's not like stuck in a groove. You can kind of go anywhere with it. And because I guess they were playing with all these electric instruments, much like maybe when Dylan went electric and the folk purists were dismissing that, the jazz purists dismissed that. But the influence that it would have on something like post-rock later is vast. That's a very unique period, because often when you hear later stuff when people try to sort of commercialize their sound or they add synthesizers or like hip-hop beats, to me it's often not very interesting. But this was incredible.
Well, essentially, he's kicking off the fusion era, the rock jazz era, shall we call it, or jazz rock, depending. But what's interesting is, especially, it's like Bitches Brew was this bam, complete sock in the face to all those jazz purists and even the free jazz people who were looking at this as like, wait a minute, we were going totally dissonant and stuff, but what are you doing? And it was something very different. I believe he was using things like echoplexes with the trumpet and things like that.
Wah-wah pedal on the trumpet too. Yeah.
So, but that's all part of this movement. You see, he was so, he saw what was going on in the hippie world, in the soul funk world, and essentially says, I got to up my game.
Yeah,
something's happening. It also sounds like he discovered more drugs then too, which is really par for the course for so many musicians at that time.
Yeah, and he married a much younger woman, Betty Davis, and she obviously influenced him a lot.
I have her album, which is quite great, by the way.
Yeah.
Female funk album is just one of the top of soul funk stuff.
Yeah, and there was these interesting things happening in the jazz world too. Of course, you do mention the free jazz, and it's interesting because the free jazz at first doesn't get because Miles Davis definitely has a little bit of free in that whole fusion sound too, and he didn't like the free jazz when it first came out, but he starts adopting it. And John Coltrane, he dies in '67,
right?
But he at first was not really into what Ornette Coleman and them were doing, but about with he starts going completely free. But it's this idea of getting into spirituality. And I know his wife, Alice Coltrane, she was involved in with Indian gurus, and she actually has some very interesting albums, which is in the early 70s. This is not easy listening.
Oh, no.
But it's super out there.
What Miles did, which was very intelligent, was to realize that it was an element in the stew, the discipline, rather than the main course.
Yeah.
And what happens with the people who really dive into the free jazz is that kind of jazz, it's just like it becomes a rarefied thing that very few people can participate in. But the truth is, it's also very religious in its way. It's saying essentially, if we just play from our hearts, we will connect. And the craziest of all, Albert Ayler, all of his titles are named after, the Holy Ghost. Music is the key to the universe or something like that. And so they're seeing it as this religious experience. The problem is they're also creating its own apocalypse.
Yeah. Well, Albert Ayler, his last two albums actually have a more of a commercial sound. He felt that pressure coming on him. And but he certainly has the most dissonant sound of any of them. Yeah. And so they're fired too. And unfortunately, he ends up, I don't know if he's murdered. He died in something happened in 1971, and it's a little open about what actually happened. But yeah, it's very fascinating. And it's interesting because then Miles's approach to fusion, Ornette Coleman comes out with a band called Primetime in the mid 1970s, and they're doing a fusion sound and it's like a free funk thing. It's really wild stuff. I mean, a lot of people, this was not stuff that's played on the charts. No. And it was definitely challenging music, but it was definitely
eventually get Herbie Hancock doing his stuff, which could be played on the charts. Some of the last really jazz music, we won't mention Kenny G anymore, but before we get there. By that time, jazz is, we used to use the phrase bed jazz for a lot of the stuff that was happening by the end of the decade that was super commercial.
Yeah, Winston and Branford Marsalis, they kind of bring back a kind of traditionalism, and while they're amazing musicians, you get this very conventional jazz that sort of gets exemplified in people like, what was that guy from New Orleans, Harry Connick Jr., like that kind of stuff, right? Like that's, I mean, I could understand wanting to maybe circle back to some of the more traditional stuff, but I think there was a way you could do it, which had more edge.
They made it kind of slick.
Yeah,
and they were also very influenced by the big band and Frank Sinatra vocalist styles, stuff like that. I compare what they were doing a bit to what was happening with what was called Dixieland jazz, which was going back to New Orleans jazz. Dixieland was more like the 50s, going back to the New Orleans jazz of the 1920s.
Yeah, the hot jazz era,
Yeah, but it's not the same thing. It acts differently, even though a casual listener might think they are the same.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I guess, You said that I think with jazz, maybe by the time you get to that fusion era, that it does become, I think you mentioned something when we talked before about it being not a genre of innovation, but of a genre of replication. And I think that probably starts happening by the 80s, though there are still really cool stuff in the underground happening. Of course, the John Zorns, the Decoding Society, people like that. But it's interesting to see where jazz goes. Outside of rock, that's probably my favorite genre of music.
Right.
And it's interesting. It's gone through similar issues that rock is in now.
Right. Well, another interesting aspect of that hippie era was because of what Dylan did, it forced all the folkies into a few different zones. One of them was towards singer-songwriter. And that's where you get the California sound and all of that sort of stuff. But another one was towards more traditional instrumentation, but adding elements. So you have jazz, mandolin kind of stuff going on. You have different countries start having different styles. So if you go to England, you've got a whole English Celtic folk rock scene. Same in Ireland. If you go to France, there's a folk rock scene there. And the further you get in, for instance, I don't know if there was, I can't think of it, a similar kind of thing happening in Sweden or Spain, Italy. And I remember looking real hard for stuff like that. There was one group from Hungary, but I think they were located in France.
So you're talking like the Fairport Convention, Pentangle, that kind of thing for the
in the UK. But then there were bands like the Dannon and Planxty and other Irish folk revivalists. And then in France and in Breton in particularly, there was Alan Stivell and Malicorn and Trion, who are very obscure to most Americans, but I really love that stuff. But the point is, it could be seen as the folky invasion, only got so far into the continent, didn't really get to Germany where Heino was still doing his Schlages.
Oh, but
the Eastern
let's talk about Germany in a minute.
Well, yeah, that's something else. That's probably the reason it didn't get to Germany, is because they were adamant in forgetting their Germanness, whereas the folk revivalists were just the opposite, especially when they added the rock and stuff. But let's save that for the electronic disco house story a little later.
Yeah, I still think it's very much a rock story too. But okay, so one of the things that also happens is when you get something like Sgt. Pepper, you open up the possibilities of all these different sounds you can put into the studio.
Right.
And what that also means is that it allows people to look into different forms of instrumentation. What a lot of people going to music colleges were studying was classical music. So this is where you start getting the rise of progressive rock.
Right.
So the first album would be at the tail end of the 60s. There's lots of precursors to progressive rock, arguably including Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, things like Moody Blues, Tales of Future Past.
Some people use the phrase art rock for the earlier period.
Yeah. So there's because it's this transition from like psychedelia to full on sort of having the progressive rock, meaning you have the high musical capabilities integrated in. So, and the first album that would really be in that genre was King Crimson's In the Court of the Crimson King in 1969.
Yeah, I think that is generally accepted as correct. Although I'm always looking earlier and saying, there's other stuff going on. But that's the first album that really mixes the thing together in a certain sort of a way.
And it was when people were watching them play at Hyde Park. Was it Hyde Park? Yeah. And with opening for the Rolling Stones, when they're seeing the playing of the musicians, you see people just going, oh my goodness, wow. And then, of course, there'd be a band that would take from some of those, another precursor band like the art rock / prog rock. It was a band called The Nice, and they had this keyboardist called Keith Emerson.
Right.
So you take Keith Emerson and you take the drummer Carl Palmer who played with the Crazy World of Arthur Brown, and you have the singer from King Crimson, and you get Greg Lake, and you get Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. And they play at the Isle of Wight Festival. Now, the Isle of Wight Festival, I think we talked about it last time, but at the end of Emerson, Lake and Palmer's set. So this is our idea that this is a super group. These three names are making this super group, and they shoot off cannons at the end of this. So this is where you're getting this big pomp, pomp and circumstance in the music.
Right. Well, they're also using the canon goes with the song America, which was from the Leonard Bernstein West Side Story.
Yeah, the nice covered version of it. Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, so you get this this is one of often controversy in musical discussions. You have the situation in the early 70s where the rock industry and rock album sales are becoming massive, that the companies are in on it. But the people who are kind of running it, the AR people, they don't really know anything about this music. Right. So literally, you have bands able to sort of indulge in things, and they're like, okay, is this long-haired music that the kids like? Okay, yeah, we'll put it out, right? These were people who maybe were growing up in the jazz era, and they had no clue about this whole progressive rock, heavy rock scenes that were happening in the early 70s. And there's quite a few great albums in that early 70s period. And then there seems to be a sort of peak when this idea that this has gone too far, this has become too indulgent. There's two sort of points here. One is this album that gets often referenced for being, the furthest thing away from rock. Yes's Tales of Topographic Ocean, which is supposed to be and it's actually quite a cool album, but it's just so unbelievably indulgent.
Right.
And then you'd have these concerts where you'd have like these extended guitar solos, extended keyboard solos, extended drum solos. And then you get the ultimate where this peaks is when Rick Wakeman, who had left Yes, and he made these really cool albums like it's Six Wives of King Henry, but these things are very indulgent. He has this thing where he does the
center of the earth.
Yeah. And he has this whole concert that he does on ice, like the ice capades, and it's so over the top.
Well, everything goes also, you've got Emerson, Lake, and Palmer taking 3 semi-trucks around with equipment, speakers, and backdrop.
Yeah, and the drum sets that they had were so unbelievably heavy. And when you get to those, they even have an album in the mid-70s called Works, and it starts out with this massive piano piece. I mean, it's like you're buying a classical album. So, however, for all that criticism, and I do think it's valid, growing up in the uber commercial 80s, when I look back at that era where people were just like, hey, I'm going to put this album out. Even if it didn't work, at least the bands had this like freedom that by the 1980s was non-existent. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about it's not so much the punk destroying it. There's something else that happens.
Right. Let me add something to hit this, which will send you off on another thing entirely, but you'll love it. And that is, I think with the birth of prog and the birth of metal and glam rock, those three together, that's a new era.
Yes. Okay.
And it's an era focused on big stadium shows. It's focused on guitar prowess, but also multi-instrumental prowess in many cases. People forget that the organ was a big deal in heavy metal in the beginning, like
for sure,
stuff like that. And there are, where does Queen fit? It kind of almost triangulates the three, although it's much more towards proggy, but it's glammy and
definitely. It's definitely a mix of those three in its own unique way. So, okay, so we've talked about prog. So, we go to this lineage that I would argue maybe starts with, I mean, you can keep going back with these things with, the distortion going right back to, what's that blues track? The Cottonmouth Blues. Right, that's one of the ones with the first distortion. But to get this heavy sort of riff sound, we have to go to like Cream and Jimi Hendrix and those bands. Right. After that, there's a band called Led Zeppelin. Right. That first Led Zeppelin album is one of my favorite albums of all time, and I love the second one too. But there's this dark heaviness to it that was not
Dazed and Confused, right?
Dazed and Confused, absolutely, which was actually a cover of another guy's song where the lyrics have been changed, but that's a whole other story.
Well, that's Led Zeppelin.
Yeah. But definitely,
the whole story practically.
It is true. That is true. But they did. I would argue they did their own versions of all those things. I mean,
of course.
But so where there's this emphasis on the riff. Now, the next band that pushes that to the next level, which was the heaviest band, and I'm arguing one of the most important bands, is Black Sabbath. So Black Sabbath takes that tritone. The distortion is full in the front. Everything's based on the riff, and it's what's so cool when you listen to Black Sabbath is that Tony Iommi, he cuts off a section of his fingertip as working in a factory, and he has to. He creates this sort of tip for his finger, this plastic tip, so he doesn't injure himself because it's just all the skin's gone. So he gets these albums by this unique guitar player called Django Reinhardt. And if you listen to guitar solos in Black Sabbath, they are totally jazz influenced.
Right.
Black Sabbath has a swing to it. It has a groove to it. It's so interesting hearing people listen to Black Sabbath for the first time. They're like, that is so groovy. That's so funky almost. And but there's also these jazzy bits too. It's amazing.
Also throwing into this period the fusion stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure.
All of this is part of one new thing now, and it's slowly being birthed. And I would say, the main things are Bitches Brew and Miles Davis, Black Sabbath's first album, In the Court of the Crimson King by King Crimson. Those are like some of the seminal records. And then the first Bowie stuff is also there to push the glammy stuff. And there's a way in which it all works as a new period.
Absolutely. So you have the glam stuff that's happening with the first the three bands you can look to are
T-Rex,
Bowie, T-Rex, and Mott the Hoople.
Right.
And Mott the Hoople actually get influenced. Bowie writes their most famous song, All the Young Dudes. Right. And that's when they're bringing the androgyny, but they're bringing back. They're kind of They're definitely reacting to the sort of hippie era where you have unwashed.
Totally said he was trying to put the stake in the heart of the hippie generation. Iggy Pop, who was also kind of connected to the glam stuff in a weird way, also did as well. They wanted it to die because they felt it was hypocritical.
Well, so it's interesting that the first two Alice Cooper albums are very, very weird ones. Before he has the Love It to Death, and he kind of takes on more of that horror image, and they're very weird. And second, like they were on Frank Zappa's albums, really wild stuff. So, and if we're talking about the other thing is this is the time of people being in those big rock concerts, and also the idea of the headphone music, and of course the quintessential album for sitting on the couch and listening to an album on your headphones is Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. But Pink Floyd only could have existed in that era because after, Syd Barrett goes, completely insane, they have these several albums that I like a lot, but they're very indulgent, psychedelic.
They don't go anywhere.
Yeah, they're really cool. I mean, they even have this concert at Pompeii that's really wild. Right. And you have these extended psychedelic jams, songs like Careful with That Axe, Eugene. But then they create this ultimate studio album that, ends up being, when I was getting into music in 1987, it was still on the top 100. It was just consistently selling. It had such a legacy to it. And that might have been the peak of that sort of what we could call the album-oriented rock. And another band that's really interesting, of course, is Genesis, because Genesis, while they are a prog rock, art rock band, they have a bit of that pageantry you find. It's not glam, but they have that theatricalness to them as well. Right.
Well, the theatrical thing, though, is with Bowie. It's with Queen. Yeah. It's with Genesis. Yeah. But I think it goes back to Arthur Brown.
Yes.
It starts wearing this helmet with fire coming out of it and wears a kimono and all.
I mean... Yeah, you have earlier stuff like Screaming Lord Sutch and things like that too. But but definitely the show, and of course,
or Screaming Jay Hawkins.
Yeah, absolutely. I put a spell on you for sure. So so for me, I come back to that early 70s period, which sort of the sort of punks react to as indulgent, but there's so much good music there at that time.
Well, the emphasis was now upon the music, as opposed to the late 60s where it was upon the message.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, because I remember as a kid, it was always the message. And we didn't pay that much attention to the actual, finesse of the playing. We liked it when it was good. but what was it saying? And that was important to me. But I think this is one of the reasons I faded from it. It's because I saw that emphasis changing. And I was, but what about the message? And so that's when I became a Christian in the Jesus movement, because that was more interesting to me to follow the message. But interestingly enough, Bill Graham, who ran the Fillmore clubs, he shut down the Fillmore in San Francisco. And in the interview with him, that's in the movie that was made of it, he says one of the reasons he shut it down, among others, including what was happening with the musicians, how their heads were getting too big and stuff, the classic musicians, was he said it was because of what he called the cement factories, which was, the Fillmore could hold, I don't know, maybe, I think when they moved to the Winterland, about 500 people, whereas what he called the cement factories, these huge arenas and stadiums, could hold 20, 30, 40,000 people or more, depending on where they were. And this really changed things.
And yeah, the amplification. So you have the who creating this loudest concert ever, 120 decibels or something like that. Right. People are going deaf. Like the amplification is just turned up so loud. And yes, you are so far removed from the performer. I just
discovered, and I didn't really realize this before, was one of Pete Townshend's best friends was Marshall, who made the amps, and he was always trying to get him to make bigger amps and stuff.
Yeah, and you have the Grateful Dead with their whole wall of sound with this packing of the amplifiers, which was, that was a whole new thing playing, and you're so far removed. And Roger Waters talks about playing this concert where he looked at this fan in the audience and he was so disgusted he spat at him, right? And that's what he writes in The Wall about that detachment from the regular people, because you are just in this big stadium.
Well, it's interesting. The people who survived from the 60s and became big in the 70s all adopted this new 70s mode. So, the Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney, The Who were all 60s figures who had adapted to this new mode.
Yeah, definitely. And you see, when you're talking about the message, you're talking about Street Fighting Man in 1968. You get to about 1972, and the Stones are like, yes, we live in the south of France, and it's this indulgent life.
And they were all taking, private jets to get to gigs, because you made a lot of money.
Yep.
If you were playing one of these big concerts. And what they would do is, one of the problems is, you have a newer act. What do? They used to have all-day events at these big coliseums where you would have a list of groups one after another. This is where Peter Frampton comes alive, so to speak.
Yeah.
And he's not a headliner at the no one knew who Peter Frampton was before his album Comes Alive came out. So he was just one of, 10 different groups in a day that was playing.
Okay, so let's finish off on two things. We have music getting pretty heavy in the early 70s. So you have the big three: Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple. They very much have that organ you were talking about. Black Sabbath. There's even things like Uriah Heep. These are big sellers. It's heavy. No one's really, there's terms in reviews where people called Black Sabbath heavy metal, but there weren't heavy metal people. There weren't metal heads.
Well, they were heavy rock, hard rock. All these terms were kind of interchangeable.
Yes, and they all kind of were grouped together. So people like Black Sabbath would also like Emerson, Lake and Palmer too. Like it wasn't like a set thing that you find later with the tribes that you talk about. Metalheads and stuff really start to form in the late 70s with the new wave of British heavy metal. And I would actually argue the first band you could consciously call heavy metal is Judas Priest, who have a couple of great albums in 76 and 77. And that really created the next stage of heavy metal.
I know Plant and Page hate being called heavy metal.
Oh, yeah.
And Ozzy was always kind of like, I don't know, what's heavy metal? Is it like, Mercury or something?
Yeah, he definitely. So there's the emergence of that, but a lot of those bands had actually kind of burned out by about the mid 70s. So Sabbath has a couple albums by 76 and 77 that are really quite indulgent. I still like them. Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die. Purple lost their original singer, or their second singer, to their third singer, and then they lost the guitarist. They break up. And I like the Led Zeppelin. I do like presence in 76, but you could see it was starting to really go downhill by that point.
Right. Well, coming up near the end of the decade, though, you start having some of the bands that are going to be really important in the future, including AC/DC.
Yes,
it's going to be a monstrous size heavy metal band.
Well, there's a whole other one that Angus Young always said we play rock and roll is what he would say, and they kind of do. They play a kind of 50s blues rock kind of thing.
Well, it's the anthemic stuff.
Yeah,
like Quiet Riot or these kind of bands that would that's song that you drunkenly sang along to, kind of thing.
Yeah, so that's a whole other thing, and so within that tapestry, you have a number of other things going on. In the UK,
I would like to just point out one thing, and I'm sure you're going to get here. Something's happening in the glam world that is starting to produce people like Joan Jett and the Blackhearts, which is starting to tip us towards stuff like punk.
They were the Runaways first.
Yeah,
there's the Runaways with Cherry Bomb.
You're right.
They were the Cherry manufactured band. She's in there. So, in fact, you actually see in two members of that band, you see the sort of split in trajectory, because Joan Jett will be, especially with the first album, she's really associated with punk. But then Lita Ford is very much a metal girl. She even marries Tony Iommi of Black Sabbath at one point. So there's that split within that band. It was Kim Fowley who ran that band. He was really quite abusive to them, apparently.
He was.
But so there's a whole bunch of other things. Did we talk about Velvet Underground last time? I can't remember.
Well, let's make a decision. Are we going to go to Germany, follow electronic, go into disco, go towards house and electronic, or are we going to go from glam and whatnot and pub rock and everything into punk?
But the thing is, those two things cross over, particularly with Can. But let's do the punk thing. Let's get that out of the way. Okay. So you have a number of different musicians that are kind of on the periphery in the 60s. Frank Zappa.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. He's bringing in weird contradictions, doo-wop music with 20th century classical, and just crudest humor that's actually very intelligent sarcasm. Right. He rips into the hippies right at the beginning.
Yeah, he's not getting stoned.
No, he's just
not getting high.
He just makes fun of them, and he makes fun of them on all levels. You have this other musician, Captain Beefheart.
Right.
Captain Beefheart is vastly more influential than people think. There would have been no Mark II of Tom Waits without Captain Beefheart.
Right.
And never mind all the weird indie rock we get. So they put out this album in 1969 called Trout Mask Replica. Now, you would think this was free improv because it's like the rock version of free jazz, but everything was meticulously written down. Captain Beefheart was like a dictator, apparently. Like, we are playing every single note, but this is the most discordant. Again, you get these surreal, obtuse lyrics with this guy who's got this gravelly blues voice. This is a very difficult album to listen to. I love it, but it's definitely not for everyone. Matt Groening talks about buying it and just thinking, what is this? This is the worst noise. He kept listening to it, and then it became his favorite album. So you have people like that. Then Andy Warhol puts together his own group, and he has that former, as you pointed out, the professional songwriter Lou Reed in that band.
But he puts it with Lou Reed with an avant-garde musician, John Cale, who's coming from Wales, the American avant-garde classical tradition.
Yeah, the minimal classical. And so but this is the birth of everything that we experienced in the 90s, because in this band you have the noise, you have the dissonance, and the pop. The pop is on top of it. So you have that contradiction that was the norm of college rock from the 80s and 90s in the Velvet Underground. And that band doesn't do well at the time, but so many people go and see them that will be influential later. And there's all these different scenes that start happening. And again, that underground in the early 70s, I have a whole video called Underground in the 70s about this topic.
Go check his channel out. Go ahead.
Thank you. And then there is this scene that develops uniquely in New York. So in New York, there's this place called CBGB's, which I believe is like country, blues, and bluegrass. And there's bands.
There's another longer name for it, but we won't go there.
Yeah, and there's another place called Max's Kansas City. So you get these bands.
Max's came first,
Yeah. Genghis Velvet's played there. That's right.
Yeah.
So you get a bunch of different bands.
And the New York Dolls.
So that's the one I want to talk about. You get a bunch of different bands. This must have been such an interesting time because there's about several bands that don't sound anything like each other. No. So you have, for example, the New York Dolls are doing the glam. Their albums never captured their live show, their intensity, apparently. No. They're dressing like full-on women, but they're like, this is so rough sounding. It's like the roughest version of the Rolling Stones. And this, a lot of people started being inspired and forming bands because of the New York Dolls. But there's other bands in the scenes too. So there's this band called Suicide, who are just doing like electronic, like weird keyboard stuff, and a singer who's playing this very nihilistic
singer, might I add.
Very provocative. And the first time they played, apparently the audience tried to beat the crap out of them.
Yeah.
Like, it just was not going down.
And they launched into it. They they were like New York guys. They're like, bring it on, man.
And then you got these other couple of bands that some of them will go on to these massive commercial heights. So we're thinking about the very early version of, I think they started as Stilettos and then they become Blondie.
Right.
And then you have the Talking Heads eventually.
Right. Who are from Boston, actually. And
yeah.
That's a whole other thing, which we will allude to, but not really get too far.
Yeah. So, but everyone's kind of going to New York. And there was another band. Oh, you remind me, from Boston. You also got a guy who was super inspired by the Velvet Underground, and he eventually does release an album, Jonathan Richman and the Modern Lovers.
Exactly.
And Roadrunner. And this is very inspired by the Velvet Underground. He even references them in the songs. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But they're playing, again, a kind of simple rock.
Well, there's another element here which we kind of passed over when we mentioned glam. So much of glam was influenced by the 50s.
Yes. And there's this huge retro to the 50s in glam and in rock in general. Because if you watch like Led Zeppelin concerts, they'll do like a thing of 50s songs at the end or something, where they play an Elvis tune.
Right.
But yes, the glam was very much, there was that whole 50s retro that was happening in the early 70s, because you have also, like American Graffiti and all these things as well. So people looking back to the 50s.
Even a pop singer like Linda Ronstadt, who's coming more out of the California scene by this point, is singing like songs by her ghost writer, Buddy Holly.
Yeah.
Or Roy Orbison.
And, oh, man, there's so much to get through here. So then you have...
Take our time.
But then you get this one band that was so unique, and they released a couple of albums, and you knew the guy because you bought album collections off of him, or you sold them album collections.
Yes.
Then we're talking about television.
Tom Miller, a.k.a. Tom Verlaine.
Tom Verlaine, after the French poet,
that he was really inspired by the Byrds, which is really weird. But you see, there's an interesting thing happening here. He's inspired by early mid-60s music. The Ramones are inspired by mid-60s music, and Patti Smith are inspired by mid-60s music, and so is Blondie.
Yes. So
what we're seeing is the shift. In a sense, glam was in the 50s and early 60s, but now these people have moved into the garage rock era and the folk rock era.
Yes, and it's very interesting because because there's something going on in London as well, in other British cities with the pub rock scene.
Yeah. So why don't you explain pub rock to people who don't really know the term?
Well, pub rock was a more kind of traditional, very 50s influence and rock and roll that was played at pubs in the early 70s in Britain. So this was sort of very different from the big stadium shows, the big stadium rock shows. So you've got who's that guy? Wilco. What's that guy's band again? Why am I drawing a blank here?
He does it right.
Wilco. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me anyway. So there's a series of bands that are playing in the early 70s. They're playing a much more conventional rock and roll, but the thing is, it's a very intimate audience because it's a much smaller audience. So people who will eventually lead the British punk scene are going in and seeing these bands play.
I would like to point out there's a great triple CD collection called Pub Rock, and I highly recommend it.
Sorry, hold on. This is bothering me. Okay, yes. So, hold on. What am I doing here? Okay. Yeah, there were some really early bands in that scene, like Chili Whitley and the Hot Players. They do more of a country rock thing. Mm-hmm. But the Dr. Feelgood, Kilburn and the High Roads, and of course, Ducks Deluxe. Okay, those are the
Kilburn and the High Roads turns into Ian Dury later.
That's right. That's right. So you have all these different people playing more of a traditional rock. So where were we here? We have the bands those bands from New York.
Some of these influence.
Yes, but I got to go back to another two things because we haven't covered them. And the two things is you got to look at the city that really puts the heart of, in my opinion, creates modern punk rock is Detroit.
Right.
There's two bands that do this.
Just go ahead and do it.
There's two bands that do this. I could argue punk rock was made by the MC5. And the MC5 first album, which they never captured in the studio, that intensity, is Kick Out the Jams. And that is just, they go Kick Out the Jams, MFers right at the beginning. And that's the statement.
They do have a recorded version of them saying Kick Out the Jams, brothers and sisters.
Yes. They would. But
Warner Brothers wanted to cover their butts. Yeah. So they recorded a second version that they could, try to get as a played on air. Of course, no one did.
So you have them, they're like the members of the White Panther Party, they're speaking revolution, and they're just playing the most intense rock and roll. But there's like guitar parts that are influenced by free jazz. They really go for it, and it's just intense, but very political. The other band you get is the Stooges. Mm-hmm. Now, Iggy Pop said he had seen like the Doors live, where Jim Morrison would start purposely confronting the audience and angering the audience, and he actually felt very inspired by this.
Right.
So he takes that to a level no one has seen. I mean, he'll leap into the audience. He'll cut himself up with bottles. Like
Jim Morrison's Dark Shadow.
He's like Jim Morrison's indestructible Dark Shadow. I mean, nothing can kill that guy. He still looks like as Jim as.
Well, it's also interesting remembering a couple things about Detroit. One, it was the headquarters of Motown. Mm-hmm. Two, there was the huge Detroit riots in 1967, which if you start listening to the Motown stuff after that, that's when it starts getting darker. Three, why don't you explain some of the other bands that were in the area at the same time, bands and singers? In other words, these weren't just two isolated guys. There was a huge, heavy scene going on.
Yeah, there were bands like, there's stuff like Frigid Pink, SRC, Bob Seger, and the Silver Bullet Band. He wasn't as heavy, but he definitely has that Detroit Motown edge. Alice Cooper was originally out of there, though he had moved. They actually went back there in the early 70s. He had moved out to Phoenix, they went to LA, and then they went back to Detroit to be part of that scene. Right. There's also that's where Ted Nugent is, with the Amboy Dukes, and then there's also Parliament. So what I heard from Alice Cooper one time in an interview is he said you could go see a concert where it would be the Amboy Dukes with Ted Nugent, Parliament Funkadelic, MC5, the Stooges, Alice Cooper, and headlining was the Who. I mean, whoa.
What a day. What a day.
Yeah. So, I mean, that would be awesome.
That's something. If you'd seen a concert setting lineup like that, you could just say, okay, I did it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, another factor is, and I think this is interesting, that in the very industrial town of Birmingham, you get Black Sabbath. In the very, the auto center of the United States, with all these factories, you get the Stooges and the MC5.
It's such a loud industrial, in a sense, sound. Not industrial in the later sense of the word, but in a way, I mean, if you've heard Iggy talking about what his first concerts look like, pretty crazy stuff.
Oh, yeah. So here's the thing, we can loop back to what we were talking about earlier with glam, is the one person who is fascinated with underground music is David Bowie. Exactly. And his three favorite artists are Syd Barrett, Lou Reed, and Iggy Pop.
Right.
Sid Barrett was long lost, so he couldn't really do anything with him. He did some I think, early Pink Floyd covers on
Right.
the
He got way too pickled in the punch.
Yeah, and he just had tendency towards paranoid schizophrenia. It was sad.
Yeah, exactly.
And but he does work with Lou Reed. And Lou Reed makes a comment, I came into the glam thing late, even though I influenced glam with Velvet Underground. The glam was, it was kind of unnatural for me. So when he releases the Transformer album in 72.
I think going back to Velvet Underground for a second, the important thing about them, besides the music, is the fact that their subject matter was pulled from very, very dark sources, from the street, from kind of low-class criminal almost elements of society. And that whole subject matter, in a sense, you could say, is the punk subject matter. It is a darker type of thing.
Like, what's the name of that novel or writer, Herbert Selby Jr., who does Last Exit to Brooklyn? It's like the equivalent of that in rock lyrics.
Right.
And then, so there's a couple of things that happen is you have Lou Reed with Transformer in 72, but then Iggy, the Stooges have two incredible albums. The second album, Funhouse, in my opinion, is the greatest rock album of all time, hands down. They kind of implode in Iggy's heroin addiction, and then he has a comeback where the lineup switches up and they have that album. And unfortunately, when it first comes out, it's the mix is not the real mix that they should have had, and that's the Raw Power album. So it's called Iggy and the Stooges in 1973, but they tour the UK, right? So there's an Iggy Pop and the Stooges touring the UK, and there's also the Ramones that will go to the UK. And those shows will inspire what will become the Sex Pistols, the Clash, and the Damned in the United Kingdom, along with the pub rock stuff.
Yeah. Well, pub rock, and also the effect of the New York Dolls and the Ramones.
Yes, absolutely. And also, because Malcolm McLaren was actually managed the New York Dolls. Right. Yes, the New York Dolls has their own implosion as well with all.
Well, the New York Dolls are really the first band to kind of really major in the themes of the Velvet Underground. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I did this whole show on a 2-part series on what was happening in Cleveland, and boy, is that interesting.
Yeah, why don't you explain a little bit about that?
Well, in Cleveland, people were listening to getting all this music, and they were forming this local scene. So they were close enough to New York that they would go see the Velvet Underground.
They're also pretty close to Detroit.
And they're close to Detroit, too. So they're getting those influences. They're also listening to the stuff coming out of Germany. They're listening to the Brian Eno albums. They're listening to, like, Hawkwind. They're listening to all these different sounds. And there's a couple of bands that get about 3 different bands that get put together. The one that's sort of the closest sounding to the Velvet Underground is this band called The Mirrors. And they don't put a lot of material out. There's another band called Rocket from the Tombs, which is the precursor to both Pere Ubu and the Dead Boys, and they kind of sound like a mix of both. But they have this incredible singer-songwriter that's just so bent on destruction called Peter Loeffner, and he was good friends with Lester Bangs. And he has some solo stuff he's done. He would do solo folk stuff, and he would deal with that dark subject matter of the Velvet Underground, which he had seen many times. And then you get this other band called the Electric Eels, who they're wearing mouse traps. They've got like distorted clarinet, sheet metal, fighting with the audience. They're just offensive in every way possible. Now, this music doesn't go anywhere, but it creates this sort of stew of creativity. See, I think what's so interesting about the early 70s is that people would hear all these different things. They'd hear the avant-garde jazz, they'd hear the avant-garde classical music, then they'd hear the punk rock, and they'd hear these weird things, and people kind of meshed them together. And this would create this really interesting creativity. Now, again, it wasn't successful, but there were bands playing this kind of music, and this wasn't happening solely in Cleveland. So
Boston was more influenced by garage rock. And then you had San Francisco was developing its own little underground scene.
Yep. And so you have so let's go across America here. You've got I can never pronounce the city's name. It's in Oklahoma. You got this really weird band called Debris.
Tulsa? No.
No, not Tulsa. It's like Chickasaw.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, anyone who's listening who lives there. They have a band called Debris who combine like nihilism, glam rock, and Captain Beefheart together. And again, their album goes nowhere, but it's so unique. In San Francisco, you get the early Chrome,
right?
And you get another band called MX80 Sound. Well, no, sorry, MX80 Sound. My mistake. They started in Indiana, and then they go to San Francisco, and then you get this really strange band that I have to do a series on, where the members put massive eyeballs on them, and they're called the Residents.
And
right?
Did we ever learn who they were?
Well, they say this. There's this group called the Cryptic Corporation that says that they interpret reality for the Residents, and then people just say, "Yeah, the Cryptic Corporation's probably on the Residents." Right?
Yeah,
that's what people figure. But that they create this incredible
name is the Residents, which they got that name from having sent out a demo and then having it returned as to the Residents of, and they said, "Okay, we'll be the Residents."
See, and that's what's so cool about that time period is that you could be listening to all these different things, and the same thing would happen in the UK. One thing that was interesting is when John Lydon was on a radio show very early on, and he was allowed to select music. He's selecting like the nihilistic prog rock band Van de Graaff Generator, and the singer of that band does an album called Nadir's Last Chance, something like that. It's almost like a punk rock album. It's in 75. It's got that 50s retro. It's really cool. He would play dub reggae, which is people were getting these records coming in where these guys are messing around with the studio. And, then he's playing like Captain Beefheart and he's playing Neil Young. So I think in that early 70s time period, you could take from a lot of different influences, right? Marky Smith of The Fall says his favorite stuff to listen to was 50s rockabilly, the Velvet Underground, 60s garage rock, and Can. And that's what they kind of mixed up to make their sound, right? It's wild. So anyway, sorry, I've talked a bit. Where should we go next?
Well, I was thinking, let's keep going into the punk and new wave story, and we'll kind of wrap this up today talking about the post-punk landscape, but we won't quite get into all the underground of the 80s yet.
Okay.
Let's also save the whole electronica story that passes through disco house and finally shows up as super big in the early aughts. Because that's a whole different kind of stream. And sometimes these things overlap, and sometimes, for instance, in the 90s, early 90s, while people were all listening to grunge and alternative and stuff, this electronic stuff was going on in the back. And I know in New York, most people I know were trying to avoid it. Because it was such a different aesthetic.
So what eventually happens is there's these bands playing around London. Malcolm McLaren had managed the New York Dolls, and then he goes back to the UK, and he puts together this band, the Sex Pistols, who play a kind of rough, primitive rock and roll, but it's got a level of rage to it that, as you pointed out, had not been seen before.
No, I went looking. I mean, I have a very big record collection. I mean, very big. And I've heard a lot of music. And I've heard music from almost every country on earth. And I have never once found music that has this kind of inchoate rage about it that Johnny Rotten brought to the table. The first hints of it are with Iggy and that stuff. But even they, it's like if you really listen to some of the stuff on the first Sex Pistols album, songs like Bodies or Not God Save the Queen, although that's got a bit of rage.
Yeah, Pretty Vacant, Holiday in the Sun.
Two versions of Anarchy in the UK, and one is on the first album. That's pretty intense. But if you listen to the one that's on the double Great Rock and Roll Swindle album, it's like Johnny Rotten is like peeling all the paint off the walls.
Yeah, for sure.
And and plus his attitude towards the audience was, whatever kind of distance had been brought by the big stadium bands in the 70s, Johnny Rotten was there to, on one hand, increase the distance in a smaller venue and increase the relationship by being actively aggressive, taking cues from Iggy and but pushing them all to another level. And that, to me, that was the thing that took the sound and went and blew everything up.
And this is what's so interesting, is that punk rock becomes a genre of music that can be instantly boiled down to a uniform. So you're saying the people who are originally in those scenes, and I've seen this in every punk rock documentary about any scene. Right. And the New York scene is a classic example. We talked about this. So all these people kind of weird doing their own thing.
Right.
Once you have the Sex Pistols breakthrough, it probably, this initial scene changed. And that's why Johnny Rotten got annoyed, because everyone's like, oh, I'm a punk now. I'd have to put a safety pin in my ear. I have to dress like this. I have to spit on performers. I have to do this.
Motorcycle jackets and you know, originally it was like the safety pin through the ears or the mouth and the spiky hair and stuff like that. And I remember in the early 90s in New York, I'd see these people and kind of like, and they were younger, and I'm kind of like, guys, didn't you get the memo?
Well, the point is that I think what they were trying to say is we want to rebel against the sort of established music. We want to do our own thing. We're doing this is very nihilistic, like we're just going to burn everything to the ground and start at year zero. But the problem is it becomes this uniform that everyone follows. So you have punk rock bands springing up, but they're a dime a dozen. And you had this particularly later with the hardcore punk scene in America. And I remember seeing Rollins in a Black Flag interview saying that when you get punk rockers or rockers in general all together, you have some of the most close-minded fascistic people you could ever meet. Because they were doing all kinds of other stuff. But we'll talk about that next time. Yeah. But what the punk rock thing, there was, I mean, especially in the UK, there was so much great music that did come out of that with, you know, of course, the big three. Of course,
there were people who were connected to that scene who were not, you know, trying to be so primitive. I mean, John Lydon, Johnny Rotten, was not a primitive. And his Public Image Ltd. was not a band of primitives doing things. And there were other people, all the people who were doing stuff in the background, you know, whether it was Wire or, you know, the Slits were trying to be primitive. But I think that it sometimes seems like a primitivist movement, and there was a certain kind of British yob who took it that way, and that's where you start getting the really more, you know, hardcore fascistic kind of oi music.
Yeah.
But one of the things, the reason for the uniform was that this was coming out of Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood. And Malcolm McLaren really influenced by a French philosophical movement called situationism. He was a situationist. That's right. He's influenced by it. And the key work there is by a Frenchman named Guy Debord called the Society of the Spectacle.
Yes.
And in that, he basically says it's all become this show. And so the situationists would try to create things to, in a sense, let you see through it. And so Malcolm McLaren with Vivienne Westwood creates this. They added the bondage gear and you know the black leather and fetish wear and stuff. They had seen the New York Dolls, and they liked that.
Well, he managed the New York Dolls.
Well, yeah, of course. But he had brought that back, and then he had seen things like Richard Hell shows up at a concert with Richard Hell and the Voidoids, or television. I don't know when Richard Hell started doing it, when he saw it, but he has written shirts, and those things went to England, were part of the club, which was simply called Sex.
Yeah, that's right. And they had a store called that, and they sold it like.
And so that they created the uniform.
So this is so interesting because so many things happen simultaneously here. One, we have this punk rock explosion. Now, apparently, you were alive at that time. I was, but I was a little kid.
I was conscious.
I was pretty young, but I heard in the United States was like most people in high school, like what's punk rock? We like the Dallas Cowboys and Led Zeppelin. That's what we like.
Well, no, what was happening was you started getting this thing that was kind of a commercial spin-off of the harder rock, and so you know bands like Journey, Foreigner, Toto, Boston, all of this stuff, which had I always call it commercial hard rock. I don't know if there's an official name for it all, but it was that stuff, so I know lots of people who, when they talk about like 1979 or 1980 or 81, they talk about Journey. They talk about Rush,
Well, I won't put Rush in that community. I wouldn't put Rush in Canada. But, No, but Rush are like a very heavy proggy band. Even though they weren't, but that's a whole other thing.
Well, they had the Castrato singer, and they had, it was all part of. I mean, what it was Rush. Was still part of that other thing, which was still there. Yeah, Rush is. And I agree, Rush is a better band, but it's all part of it. It's Rush is still, and this goes into the '80s a while, but Rush is still part of the world of prog bands, metal, glam, and all the rest of it. That was that mid '70s thing. But of course, these eras overlap each other. Yeah, no doubt. I can tell you about the punks. Is they wanted all other forms to die, later some of them would take back what they were saying, but they wanted all the prog stuff to just go away. Certainly, they wanted metal, nothing to do with metal at first. So what happens is and hippies were their bane. Yes, there's three things here. One, with punk, it was creating that year zero. So a lot of the established bands, at least maybe in the UK, definitely took a hit and weren't considered so hip anymore. That's one. But the biggest factor in changing the music industry and bringing in the heart, the Boston, that whole kind of era of music that was like from about 76 onwards is what you alluded to earlier with the Frampton Comes Alive, because Frampton Comes Alive is a live album that does such massive numbers that the amount of people who get involved in the music industry changes. And so many people start investing in the music industry. So now there's a pressure on commercialization. So you still get some interesting bands. Like I actually quite like Supertramp, but they're definitely they're this like what we call either pop rock or symphonic rock. Right. There's this ELO bands like that where you're not going to indulge and have a 3-part symphony in your song anymore. You're going to very much go back to the pop hook. So it might be very clever and very produced. When I think of Supertramp, I just think of 1979. Yeah, it was everywhere, and then it disappeared. Yeah, because other things were coming in, and also they weren't the kind of band that was going to make videos, and that was the thing coming in the '80s. Okay, that's a whole other era. We'll worry. But so you have these huge sellers like the Fleetwood Macs, which is a band that started very different where they ended up. Here's the thing. From my observation, the two biggest things that the punks hated were hippies and disco. Although, as we know about disco, well, then you have Blondie doing Heart of Glass. You have Ian Dury doing some very odd stuff with disco rhythms and jazz stuff. And those are more on the punk new wave spectrum. So it's not as simple as they just simply rejected it, but that whole Studio 54 thing was not what they were doing, so although in New York, who knows? In New York, would crossover, certainly among the people who were pumping illegal substances into themselves. This is an off point, but one thing that's so interesting to me is that disco for the longest time became this music that people could absolutely hate on. And maybe because I'm a child of the 80s. Right. I mean, I recall disco being so unhip that at a school dance, they said, if you guys don't get up and start dancing, we're going to put disco songs on. Like it was just considered. It's an example of a trend gets so big and then it's so uncool. Right. It just was this reaction to it. Right. Unfortunately, that happened with all the louder alternative stuff the second half of the 90s too. In a different way. But it's like no one wanted to hear the loud thing. They wanted to hear, the people who were cool wanted to hear the stuff that was like more subtle. Still had noise, but it was a drifting. Yeah. I get what you're saying. I just think at a cultural level, like
and this is what happened in the millennium. Maybe I'm getting off topic here, but this is like, I just remember if you walked around with bell bottoms in the 1980s, you would be socially ostracized.
Right.
If you walked around with an acid wash jeans in the 1990s, you'd be socially ostracized. By the time you get to millennium, you don't have these reactions against the previous decade that you had before. You know what I mean?
Right. Well,
so
it was during this whatever we call the late 80s, early 90s era that you started to have a mixing of punk and metal and all these other alternative sounds. And I think that created a different environment. But of course, all of this is going to be washed away by the time you get halfway through the aughts.
Yeah.
You know? So going back to the punk and new wave, and you start to see what I think is really important about this period is you start to see the tribalization of these new sounds. So that after a while, you've got neo-ska, you've got goth, you've got things that people are actively calling post-punk, which is mostly coming out of the UK and has these kind of fractured rhythms like Gang of Four and the Au Pairs and such.
The Fall, I'll mention
that. You've got the remnants of the pub rock scene, people like Nick Lowe and Dave Edmunds and stuff, but they're now going towards a slightly older crew, so they're no longer so much a tribe. And then you've got the hardcore punks, and then you've got the post-Motorhead people in the UK, who is the new heavy metalers who are now trying to get faster and more intense.
Well, okay, so with those heavy metal people, you first have this emergence of something called the new wave of British heavy metal,
right?
Where these guys said
late 70s, isn't it?
Late 70s, they wanted a loud music, but they're like, we're not punks. We can play our guitars. Okay. We are musicians. So when they had these heavy metal clubs, guys would bring in, like, they do air guitar and they'd have like a fake wooden guitar they bring in, and these guys would air guitar the songs. So they'd be playing all these new singles. Most famous, of course, being Iron Maiden, but you had bands like Tigers of Pantang, Saxon, Angel Witch, all these Diamond Head, all these different bands that were in that underground scene. And that's where the birth of the actual metal, I'd argue the heavy metal genre and identity starts, where you have the studded leather, the cutoff jean jackets, but you could even like the hard rock. So you could like the Rush, you could like the AC/DC, you could like the Led Zeppelin still, but you're the new wave of British heavy metal. The band that's in the middle of all that is Motorhead. Right. Lemmy was kicked out of Hawkwind, and he was obsessed with bikers.
Right.
Because he was always doing speed. So then he wants to form this band that's like takes that raunchy 50s rock, and he actually was friends with the Damned. He actually played with the Damned.
Motorhead was one of the few metal bands who could play at a punk rock concert,
he played with the Damned in this Lamp of the Doom, and he'd just say, "We thought we were punks, but they said our hair was too long," right? So. So Motorhead's in the middle of all that too, with that double bass drum you get with like Overkill. But where the next change in metal actually goes back to America, and you've got these bands in LA that are hearing this new wave of British heavy metal, but they're also into a lot of hardcore punk. Right. So they love the bands like Black Flag and the Misfits.
But let's save that.
Okay, you want to save that? Okay, I could do a whole thing on that.
Because otherwise, we're going to go on a whole thing here, and we want to save that. We want to talk about next time. What we'll do is we'll talk about Germany a bit, electronic music. We'll go into the production stuff and the disco world. Then we'll go how the post-disco world does two kind of things at once. One is it takes a backdoor through Detroit house music and heads towards electronica. And then the other way is they actually, through things like Blondie's Heart of Glass and stuff, they go into pop music and creates a more, shall we say, mechanical beat for a lot of the 80s popular music. I mean, Madonna is totally influenced by disco. And I always thought it was funny that she kind of looked like a punk.
Well, that's a whole other thing. Sorry. Yeah, I did two videos on why I don't like how the 80s killed music and why I hate electronic dance music. So these are going to be
and I've got the video you discovered from me above the surface level and the underground. Two long videos on surface and underground in the 80s and how different it was.
Absolutely. And how all that gets commercialized in the 90s is even more fascinating.
Right.
So,
well, of course,
I think we covered a lot today.
Yeah, of course. What we've done is we've set up. Oh, let me talk about how I noticed the punk scene and the new wave scene were coming to a commercial end. Can you guess what band told me that the loudest?
U2?
No, although they're a good guess. Although they're not as commercial as the band I'm about to name. Although I did go to the Clash concert at Bonds in 1980, right after Sandinista came out, and I felt like, nah, this isn't going to last. Their audience is now mutating from punks to just regular people living in the suburbs and stuff.
Yeah.
No, it was when the Police released their first albums, because the Police kind of came off as new wavy, but it was very clear that they're great musicians. But it was their whole mindset. For instance, while the punks are singing and the new wave artists are singing all these dark themed songs about the problems of technology, the problems of living in this modern world, a world without that hippie dream. Sting is writing songs about being ghosts in the machine and being, a lot of his songs, you can see this kind of trippy new thing happening in there, and that's going to be a vibe that's going to continue through a lot of the 80s.
I'm sorry, I just want to add, I'm very divided on the Police, because the Police the players very much come from the prog rock jazz fusion world.
Exactly.
But having said all that, a lot of their music is really actually quite interesting, and everything you said is right about their. And when Sting goes solo, that's an abomination and should be banned.
Although, I agree with you on that. And I remember seeing, I can't remember his real name, walking around the streets of New York a couple of times. But having said that, he has done some interesting music more recently than certainly the late 80s and 90s stuff.
But the last, I love the Synchronicity album, and I love some of the Police albums. I love the musicianship on them, because of the way they did incorporate reggae and they incorporate these other genres. But yes, this is not punk rock nihilism. This is not underground music in any way.
No.
And were you talking about maybe why you put Rush in with those other bands? If you listen to Rush after Moving Pictures,
right,
they're influenced by the Police. That's why their songs get shorter.
Well, a lot of people started getting influenced by the Police. The Cars, although the Cars are in a kind of a different zone.
Yeah.
Blondie's move towards disco fuse these different elements together, and in a way you can look at most of the pop music on MTV in the all the stuff certainly coming from England, and also a lot of the stuff that was American, as being commercializations of the stuff. So for instance, The Cure had all these hits in the late 90s, and I thought after their Pornography album, I thought, okay, they should just stop, because it's quite clear that someone's looking for a razor blade here. And then they come out with Love Cats. I'm going, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
And then they go on, and Robert Smith has his own things. I did see Robert Smith play with Susie and the Banshees in New York, and the whole goth thing was there as well. But for instance, when you start looking now, a good version of the commercialization is a group like the Eurythmics. And I think that Sweet Dreams Are Made of This is just like a masterpiece, both the video and the song. But that's also got a serious finger back in the theme of that song. It's got a serious finger back in the punk new wave pie.
Yeah, and there's definitely the Can influence and stuff like that there you hear.
Right.
Like that's a whole other fascinating thing that maybe we have to talk about, because I remember watching, but before we had any music channel in Canada, we watched these countdown top 30 videos that would be on weekly, and you'd have, you'd get this contrast, because number 2 would be Sweet Dreams Made of These, and number 1 would be All Night Long by Lionel Richie. So you'd have this smorgasbord of videos, right?
Yeah.
But of course, I had no clue what the underground was, because it's just non-existent in this world, right? So the rise of video is the whole other thing.
Yeah. Well, we're going to deal with that, as well as the commercialization of what video did. We'll talk also about the whole electronic to other pipeline, and we'll discuss the underground. But we'll see. Maybe we'll get stuck on that other stuff, but we'll see. And,
we covered a lot. We could talk.
This is open-ended. I mean, Although I have the feeling once we get to the year 2000, it's going to get really short.
Yeah. I don't have much to say at that point.
21st century.
Yeah.
So.
All right.
Okay. Well, James, thanks for coming aboard again. And eventually this will show up on your channel. So come back and see the Anadromist and the Anadrome, where I have videos about this stuff.
Absolutely.
And you have any final words for today's
I just hope that people can reference some of this stuff and get familiar with this music. I have always found that when I play people a lot of different music from the past, that they actually are receptive to it. Yeah. So they just haven't been exposed to it. So I'm just hoping people can go back and, kids, if there's any young people out there, go investigate this. It's awesome. You can just go, and there's so much to learn here. So go listen to this stuff.
I agree. Okay. So James, have a good day, and I'll have a good evening here in studio.
Thanks for having me on, Byrne. It's always a pleasure.
Okay. I am ending the recording now.
The American immediately watch the blood running out of the bullet hole in his chest. The American immediately watch TV. And the other news is what the man said. That's not what you can do for your country. But they can't do that to you. That's not what you can do for your country. But the country they're doing to you, babe. The American immediately wanted to die in a war that's just so fucking enough. The American immediately
Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about our conversation or what you think about music in the 70s. Thank you.